Hello and welcome. How much is a lack of foreign reporting hurting America's media? And more importantly, keeping the public of the world's superpower ignorant? U.S. news outlets have continually shut down their bureaus around the globe as budgets for international coverage shrinks, and the results are painfully visible. There's much debate about the devolution of American media into junk news and tabloidism, as media conglomerates feel massive pressure to turn huge profits, which has created an obsession with ratings and an infatuation with glitz over substance. At the same time, the recession has caused many media companies to shut down their offices abroad, which also means less international news on American airwaves. The one area that's proving to be a saving grace for journalism with some depth is the internet, where websites are becoming a more valuable primary source of news, including international stories, for people worldwide. Today we ask, are the American media failing their public, and what are they doing to the country's perceptions of the rest of the world? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send in an SMS or an email. Joining me today are two renowned American journalists. Amy Goodman's the icon of independent and progressive journalism, best known as the principal host of Democracy Now!, a daily news and talk show that airs on U.S. public radio, TV and the web. Most recently, she published a collection of columns, Breaking the Sound Barrier. And she's also written several books about the media and the dangers of the corporate-owned media. She joins us from the Democracy Now! Studios in New York. And with me here in the studio is John Maxwell Hamilton, a former foreign correspondent and now the Dean of the Manship School of Mass Communication at Louisiana State University. He's the author of Journalism's Roving Eye, a history of American foreign reporting, which tells the stories of reporters who helped shape America's view of the world and also influenced U.S. foreign policy. I welcome you both to the show.
Thanks.
It's great to be with you.
Thanks, Amy. If I could start with you, foreign reporting, okay, foreign reporting in the American media is in decline. What do you feel is the bigger reason? Is it simply budget cuts, or is it that it's just driven by a lack of interest in international news by the American public?
Oh, no, I think it works the other way around, Riz. I think if there isn't information about what's happening in the rest of the world, then if people don't know, they can't act. It is absolutely critical now, though more than ever, when you have the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the drone attacks in Pakistan, when you have the attacks in Yemen, the U.S. involvement in Somalia. This is the time we have to expand. And I really do think that if people knew, they would care. But they get most of their international news, if they're not from another country or know people from other countries, from the media. So it's a grave threat to national security when news bureaus around the world shut down.
Well, let me give you a question that came in from a viewer, if I may, Amy. It's from David Ortega, who's in Mexico, who wrote in saying, in the 15 years I spent in the U.S., I had to make the effort and find information for myself. It was never readily available through the mass media outlets. And that's what made me want to ask you, do you think, I mean, when it comes down to it, Americans can be persuaded to take the kind of interest in international news that people in other countries do?
Oh, I think there's no question about it. But it takes something other than a corporate lens to see the rest of the world through. Like Democracy Now! Is on public radio and television and deeply concerned about, well, the fact that we are one community and we have to know each other. And when you have the situation that we have in the United States today, where news bureaus are shutting down, and even when they're not, it's so heavily filtered through a kind of political lens. It's a very big problem. I mean, the fact of the matter is people do care. Let's take the example of what happened in Khost in Afghanistan, where you had the suicide bombing that killed a number of U.S. soldiers, people from the CIA, members of Blackwater, the mercenary operatives, now known as ZXE. When that got coverage, people all over this country cared. Now, we should care about every individual, but when it is American, we will learn usually. When it's people from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from Iraq, it is much harder to have the media focus attention, and so people don't learn. But when they do, it matters. When they do, they care.
John Hamilton, glad to have you on the show as well, sir.
Thank you.
Now, it's a subject you've written about, now, and I wonder how you feel that the lack of international coverage in the American media is affecting the country's foreign policy. I mean, can the government do what it wants largely because the public has no clue what's going on?
Well, actually, can I go back and challenge the assumption?
Sure.
I'm not sure that you can say broadly that foreign news is in decline. There's lots of data to show that foreign news has always been a precious commodity. With the one exception, in the cases of wars. And it's been that way throughout all throughout the 20th century. I I think furthermore, even though I make my living on foreign news and have and care a lot about it, the fact is foreign news has the smallest audience and it's the most expensive news to get. And for that reason, the audience part in particular, media companies, with the exception of some elite media, relatively elite media, tend to find it difficult to support foreign news, especially at a time when the old model for news gathering, original news reporting, and selling of it has broken down. Now, there are exceptions. But the bigger exception is that while traditional media has now particularly declined, there have been other areas where the amount of foreign coverage has actually increased. If you take, for example, the number of traditional journalists that have disappeared with the major metropolitan newspapers, for example, and broadcast, they do not even equal 1/5 of the number of reporters that Bloomberg News has put abroad since 1992, when it started doing foreign news. And that's just one example, because there are other people who are in other media organizations that are providing news. Bloomberg, of course, focuses particularly on financial news. So the first thing I just say is, if you look at this from a historical point of view, I think to get some perspective, it's not like this all of a sudden just happened. It's an endemic problem.
But it's surely, if, in the same way they say about construction, build and they will come. In the same way with America, if they realized how important the country is outside, surely they would also take a greater interest in what's going on with the policies.
Well, there's a lot of argument. A lot of journalists like to say, as Saul Linowitz did many decades ago about Latin America. He said, he challenged Scotty Reston, who said Americans will do anything for Latin America except read about it. And Saul Linowitz said, well, journalists will do anything for Latin America except report about it. But I'm afraid to say that the data show very clearly that the American public generally is not that interested in foreign news. And we can say we think it's important for them, but by and large they don't. Now, you can make the argument if they got more of it, they might read it. But the fact is, when you look at what people actually do read, there's a reason why networks don't provide as much foreign news as the American news networks as we would like them to. And it's not because they're bad people, it's because of the cost and the audience.
I'll get back. We have a chart to show our viewers in a second, but let me get back to Amy Goodman here and ask, who's policing the U.S., who's policing basically U.S. foreign policy? Who's making sure that what's going on outside the borders of this country is what, the politicians say? How can people here have an idea that their wishes are being met by those they elect?
That's the key question. Independent media is essential to the functioning of a democratic society, especially in a time of war. I think it's interesting that Professor Hamilton is from Louisiana, because when Hurricane Katrina hit, the U.S. media did go there in force. And what was interesting at the time, of course, it was President Bush and his administration not responding. The side effect of the Bush administration not sending in the National Guard, for example, right away, many of them were, by the way, in Iraq, was that when the media got there, there were no troops to embed with. And you saw something very different. For the first time, you saw the media unspun. Now, true, this was domestically. One of the first things President Bush tried to do was impose an executive order that said you could not show the bodies floating in the water. And I remember the editor of the Times-Picayune, the local paper there, said, "You've got to be kidding, that's the story." Could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw the images of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the babies dead on the ground, with the women with their legs blown off by cluster bombs, the soldiers dead and dying? For just 1 week, I really do think Americans are compassionate people, and they would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. But they don't see. And that is the issue. That is the problem. People can die, both in other countries and U.S. soldiers, because the American public is not seeing. You even had the situation of Afghanistan, where most people were opposed to the escalation of war there. But we get so little coverage, it's hard to understand what's happening, and hard to understand why other individuals and countries respond to us the way they do, because we don't even see the effects of our own actions in other countries.
Now, Professor, we have a chart we can show our viewers which show a collection of the number of minutes of international news coverage that have been shown by the 3 main networks in America during these years that are illustrated here between 1988 and about 2009. And we see peaks, it's certain areas there. I think 88, 89, we've got the change
Berlin Wall coming down, absolutely.
Communist,
and that was, I think, one of the last great moments for American broadcast journalism.
And then
where they really mounted tremendous media coverage. It was really sensationally good.
Right, and then 2003 we've got Iraq, of course. Now, is it the case that it takes something as extreme as conflict for people to have taken interest in what's going on?
Well, you know, the thing about wars is that, and this also explains why it always gets as much coverage as it does, is really a local story. It's a story about your neighbor's kid or your own kid going to war. It's a story that becomes tangible and immediate. And so for reasons of, that's the reason why we get so much war coverage, especially when it's a war we're actually involved in. There is a bit of an anomaly because we're now in a war and the war coverage is actually tapered off, but I think there's some anomalous reasons to explain that. We don't have a draft. That's clearly one reason, and there's some others.
Well, Professor and Amy, I'm going to ask you to both stand by. We've got to take a short break here. We have more of our discussion in just a moment. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the state of the US media, especially when it comes to coverage of international affairs and American foreign policy. I'm joined by Amy Goodman, the host of the daily news and talk show Democracy Now!, who's at her studios in New York. With me here in Washington is Dr. John Maxwell Hamilton, a former foreign correspondent and Dean of Journalism at Louisiana State University. And Amy, a couple of questions here from our viewers, if I may put these to you, two of them back to back on a similar theme. The first one's from Eritrea. Saba in Asmara writes in saying, a wise man said that war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. Now that America has wars on multiple fronts, soon to add Yemen and Nigeria, is it safer to quiz an American on geography? And the other one came in from the UK, from Ozbek Inal, who says, I met an American once and he was talking about Iraq, and I asked, where is Iraq? Guess what he said? It's in Africa. That's how the American people know the world they live in. They like junk food the same way they like junk news. I mean, it's, you know, obviously a bit of a damning commentary from some of our viewers here, but it's pretty bad that many people here don't really have a clue about the rest of the world and where it is. I mean, is that fundamentally an educational problem beyond the news itself? Is it something in our schools that needs to be fixed?
Oh, I mean, there's no question about it, but I also think the mass media is the way most people get their news and why it's so critical, why we have an absolute obligation as journalists to provide a forum for people to speak for themselves all over the world. I think these are very, very telling comments of your viewers. It makes me think back in World War II, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, when they were choosing the sites in Japan to hit with the atomic bombs. Ultimately, they chose Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But he took Kyoto off of the bombing target list because he and his wife had visited there, and he loved it. And I think that's very telling. When people learn about other people, when they hear other stories, when they learn about other countries, it's much more difficult to be belligerent against them. And I just want to talk about a personal story, which is also a historic story. In 1991, I was in East Timor, small island nation about 300 miles above Australia. It was occupied by Indonesia at the time. And the Indonesian military committed a massacre there. More than 250 Timorese were killed. I survived the massacre. My colleague, Alan Nairn, was beaten by the soldiers. They fractured his skull. But more than 250 Timorese. Indonesia occupied that country for a quarter of a century, beginning in 1975. From that moment when they occupied until 1991, when that massacre took place, in the United States, the three major networks, their newscasts never mentioned the words East Timor. It was one of the great genocides of the 20th century. More than 200,000 Timorese were killed. But when the coverage of the massacre took place in 1991 that we witnessed and survived, from that point on in the United States, because it got some coverage, it became the foreign policy issue that most people called their Congress members about to ask them to do something about it, to stop supplying weapons to human rights abusing regimes. It was remarkable. And that was just a matter of opening the window on a country and finding out why the United States was supplying weapons to the Indonesian military. I truly do think that Americans, like people all over the world, care. Civilians do care, but they have to know what is happening in order to do something about it.
Well, John Hamilton, in your book, Journalism's Roving Eye, you put together stories of how foreign correspondents actually can have an influence on foreign policy. What did you find in terms of the strongest examples of where someone says something out there and shows what's going on, and it does make a difference?
Yeah.
Here?
I think the golden age of American foreign reporting was the 1930s, and one reason for that was because of the large number of journalists who were able to make a living abroad, often as independent journalists, as freelancers even, and could write with great authority because they had been abroad for a long time. And although we think of that era as being a time of American isolationism, in fact, if you look at it, Americans did a sensational job, and there were reasons for that. They could make a good living. There were lots of magazines they could write for. Broadcast was coming along. Lots of news services had foreign services. Americans were liked, which meant that American journalists were people that other people wanted to talk to and give access to information, which of course doesn't exist today. Americans aren't well liked. And so that was a great age. Those journalists were great because they knew what they were talking about and had years abroad. Now, there have since, of course, been wonderful journalists, and Amy Goodman is one of them, and there are many others. The one that stands out in my mind and is a good example of the problems with dealing with authority and telling people things they need to know they may not want to hear is the story of Harrison Salisbury going to North Vietnam. And he was the first establishment journalist to get in there and was able to demonstrate within hours of arriving that the American bombers were actually hitting civilians. And that story flew absolutely in the face of what the administration was saying and what they wanted the public to believe. It was so difficult for Salisbury after that. In fact, even his own newspaper assiduously went out and told reporters to get people that would report the administration side of the story, because once administrations have consensus behind them, it's very difficult to resist that huge juggernaut of opinion. He did it. He had enough credibility, and he was a strong enough personality, and he had an impact on American public opinion about that war, but it required an awful lot.
That makes me want to put a question to you that we got from Mississippi here in the USA, from John Parker, who wrote in saying, the US networks are helping with the deliberate dumbing down of Americans. We as a country know a lot less about the world around us than ever before. It's a very sad fact of American culture. Americans want their news fast and sugar-coated. But in terms of the direct dumbing down, I mean, what you say is an example of where the networks are actually deciding we will follow a particular policy which may be in favor of the government or not.
Well, I don't think it's that simple. I think it's more complicated. I don't think the executive say, let's follow the government policy. But here's the thing, if you're a journalist, you tend to you need attribution, you need sources, and you tend to go to the ones that are the most authoritative. And so when you go, and as was the case in the run-up of the Iraq War, you end up going to those, and there's a huge consensus about that war. It's hard to find credible sources that look credible to the editors and to the public that aren't sources that are in favor of the war. And that's why so much of the American media, with a few exceptions, found itself sort of climbing on that bandwagon. As soon as that consensus broke down among experts, among members of Congress, then the press had a greater ability to start reporting a diverse range of viewpoints. But an administration always has a huge advantage. The other problem, by the way, I would mention that I think is a huge problem today is technology. Foreign correspondents in the past would be abroad, and we'll use the New York Times as an example, and Edwin James, who was the managing editor, had a policy. When a foreign correspondent sent in a story, it was either published or not, but it wasn't tampered with.
Right.
And one of the reasons for that was they trusted the reporters, but another reason was it was hard to talk to the reporter and edit. Today, a lot of our foreign correspondents, and that doesn't mean there aren't many, many good ones, find themselves being constantly referenced to what editors in Washington think, or what editors think Washington thinks. And that's a huge problem, because instead of being independent and finding out things that we don't know, they're confirming or thinking in terms of what we think we already know.
Amy, actually on this point, and it's an interesting point that John Hamilton raises here, it's the technology has changed so much in recent years. I mean, I've witnessed so much just in my lifetime in this industry. It's been, you know, it's become instant news. There's blogging, there's the internet. What has it done to the next generation of journalists, so to speak, in terms of quality, in terms of guaranteeing that the information that's out there is really quality stuff?
Well, on the one hand, people have to be very careful, obviously, about the internet because it can be a global rumor mill. But something that's very important that it's opened up is it's challenged the traditional gatekeepers. I think that John Hamilton is right. When it comes to the mainstream media, so often they simply acted as a conveyor belt for, I have to say it, the lies of the administration. For example, when it came to Iraq, there were many credible sources, even within the military, high high up, even within U.S. intelligence, high up. The UN weapons inspectors that had been in Iraq that were saying there aren't weapons of mass destruction. That wasn't the consensus, of course, of the Bush administration, at least their public line. But unfortunately, the mainstream media ate it up because they didn't want to suffer the repercussions of being cut off by the U.S. government. But that is not our role as journalists. It is to be a watchdog of the government. It is supposed, we are there to challenge, to hold those in power accountable. And there's no more important time than in a time of war, because the lies take lives. I think the mainstream media reached an all-time low when it came to the coverage of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think the embedding process has a lot to do with it, because when you have reporters in the front lines of troops, I'm not saying they're not brave, but what kind of picture are you going to give back to the United States when you're eating with the troops, you're sleeping with them, your lives are in their hands? It gives you one perspective from the trigger end of the gun. Right. But we need reporters embedded in Iraqi hospitals and Afghan communities and the peace movement around the world to convey the full effects of war. We need unembedded reporting, and that is very dangerous.
John, about 45 seconds to go. When you look at your students, do you see the passion for journalism that you know, from when you were a reporter, for example?
Well, you know, it's interesting that at a time when the traditional media seem to be in disarray, print and broadcast, the numbers of our journalism students has actually increased. So why are they doing that? Well, I think for one thing, they're able to think more creatively about how to get news and present it than old people like me who came up in the traditional way, working on newspapers and working for traditional broadcast. So I think there's always hope. And the one thing is, although foreign news coverage has historically always been tenuous, the fact is there have always been committed people who are geniuses in news, who find ways to bring news to us. We wish there were more, but they're always there and they always will be there.
John Hamilton, thank you very much. Amy Goodman, pleasure to have you on the show as well.
Thank you, Riz.
Thank you for being with us too. Remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to there. You can give us feedback on the topics we cover and post your questions and comments. From me and the team, goodbye.
Da